Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're getting into this paper about AutoKeras. It's that open source library that's supposed to make deep learning something anyone can use.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, right? I mean, we've all heard about deep learning by now
For sure.
and how it's behind like all these amazing technologies, personalized recommendations, medical breakthroughs,
It seems like it's everywhere.
but it can definitely feel like a bit of a black box. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Especially if you're not a coder, which, let's be honest, a lot of people aren't.
Right. And that's where this whole AutoKeras thing comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. The paper makes it sound like it's the key to unlocking this whole other level of deep learning.
Mm-hmm.
So before we even get into the details of how it works,
Sure.
we should probably take a step back and talk about what deep learning is.
Okay, so at its most basic, deep learning is about teaching computers to learn from data. And it actually kind of mimics how our own brains work.
Mhm.
Yeah. Like imagine you feed a computer tons and tons of information, images, text, even sensor data.
Okay.
And these deep learning algorithms, they can analyze all that data and find patterns in it.
Uh-huh.
And then it can use those patterns to do things like make decisions or predictions.
Okay, I think I get that. But where does AutoKeras fit into all of this? This paper keeps calling it an AutoML library for deep learning, and honestly, that doesn't mean much to me.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So think about it this way. Building a deep learning model is kind of like trying to bake a cake, but you don't have a recipe.
Okay.
So you've got all these ingredients, right? The
Yeah.
data, the algorithms, but figuring out what to use and how much, that can be really, really complicated.
Yeah.
And it takes forever to get it right. AutoKeras takes care of all that for you.
So instead of me spending weeks trying to figure out this model thing, AutoKeras will just, do it for me.
Exactly.
Mm.
It basically automates the hardest parts of building these deep learning models, like choosing the model architecture,
Mm.
which is basically like the structure of the model itself.
Okay.
And it tunes something called hyperparameters.
Hyperparameters, now those sound kind of intimidating.
They sound scary, but I promise they're not that bad.
Oh.
So think of hyperparameters like the knobs and dials on an oven. Right?
Okay, I like where this is going.
They're what control how fast your model learns
Right.
and how complex it can get. AutoKeras, it's kind of like this robot baker
I love that.
that finds the absolute perfect settings so that you get a perfect cake every time.
And the perfect cake is our deep learning model working exactly how we want it to. I am starting to see why people are excited about this, but how does it actually work? Does it just magically create these perfect models out of thin air?
Not magic, but it is pretty cool. So remember when we were talking about AutoKeras being this AutoML library?
Yeah.
Well, AutoML stands for Automated Machine Learning, and basically that means it's using these algorithms and techniques to do the hard work of building the models for us.
Okay.
And one of the big things it uses is something called prior knowledge.
Prior knowledge. So it's like AutoKeras already knows a bunch of deep learning stuff. It comes pre-programmed with it or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to think about it. It's not like it's starting from scratch every single time.
Wow.
It actually uses this giant library of existing knowledge.
Yeah.
Think of it like, I don't know, a bunch of blueprints or something.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, blueprints of deep learning architectures and hyperparameter settings that it already knows work well. And it uses all that to kind of quickly zoom in on the best solutions. The paper compares it to a hill climbing algorithm, actually, which I always thought was a really good way to explain it.
A hill climbing algorithm. Okay, I am all about a good analogy. Tell me more.
So imagine that you're trying to, climb to the top of a mountain, but there's like really thick fog. You can't see where you're going.
Right. Tricky.
Right. So you have to use your senses, what you can feel around you, to figure out which way to go. So you take a step and you see, okay, is the ground sloping upward here? Or is it going down? If it's sloping upward, you know you're going in the right direction, towards the top, and you keep going. But if it's sloping downwards, you know you need to change course and try a different path.
So AutoKeras is kind of like constantly checking its progress
Yeah.
and making these tiny little adjustments along the way until it reaches the peak of the mountain, the absolute best possible model.
Exactly. It's always iterating and testing and refining until it gets to the very, very best solution. It doesn't just stop at something that's good enough,
That's really cool. Okay, so the paper mentions these different levels of APIs, the task API, the IO API, and the functional API. Are those different ways to interact with AutoKeras?
Yeah, exactly. Think of those APIs as like giving you different levels of control over how the model gets built.
Okay.
So the task API, that's like the easiest one to use.
Easy mode.
Exactly. It's perfect if you're just starting out or if you don't want to get into the weeds of all the technical stuff.
Makes sense.
So you just tell AutoKeras what you're trying to do. Like, I need to classify these images, or I want to predict this value, and it figures out everything else.
So you're saying with the task API, I could theoretically build a deep learning model to organize my cat pictures, even if I failed coding in high school.
Exactly. It's surprisingly user-friendly.
Yeah.
Now, the IO API, that stands for input-output, by the way, gives you a little bit more control, but it's still pretty intuitive.
More control over what specifically?
So if the task API is like saying, just bake me a cake, I don't care what's in it, the IO API is like saying, okay, I want this kind of flour and these kinds of sprinkles.
So the IO API is like choosing the ingredients for the cake. I like it.
Exactly. It lets you choose what format your data is in and how you want the model to understand it.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about that last one, the functional API? That's for the deep learning experts, right? The people who can already code their own AI from scratch.
You can say that.
Yeah.
So that functional API, that gives you the most fine-grained control over, well, pretty much everything. You can customize the entire architecture of the model, tweak individual hyperparameters.
Wow.
It's basically like you have access to all the ingredients, all the tools, everything you could ever need to perfectly tailor the model to your exact specifications.
So AutoKeras really has something for everyone. We've got easy mode, we've got choose your own ingredients mode, and we've got expert chef mode.
Precisely. And that's one of the things that makes it so powerful. It's not just for academics or huge tech companies anymore. It's something anyone can potentially use.
This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started. We went from what even is deep learning to diving into all the cool stuff AutoKeras can do, but we're just scratching the surface here, right?
Oh, yeah, we are just getting started. There's so much more to talk about. Like, how are people actually using AutoKeras to solve real-world problems?
Right.
There's some amazing stuff happening right now, from healthcare to, designing sustainable cities, all using AutoKeras.
Okay, now that is something I have to hear more about. We are going to take a quick break, but we will be right back. And when we come back, we're going to dive into all of that and more. You know, thinking about these different levels of AutoKeras and how easy it makes things, it really seems like this could change who gets to use AI, you know? Like, not just the people who can code all day long.
Absolutely. That's a really important point. I mean, for a long time, deep learning has been this exclusive thing.
Right.
Limited to people with very specific knowledge.
And the resources to make it happen, right? Like, not everyone has access to a bunch of fancy computers.
Exactly. But AutoKeras kind of changes all of that, doesn't it? It makes it possible for people to do amazing things, even without all the traditional barriers.
So instead of needing, a PhD in computer science to do something cool with AI,
Right.
you could have, say, a doctor who wants to use it to figure out a way to diagnose a rare disease.
Yes.
Or, I don't know, a teacher who wants to tailor their lesson plans for each student.
It's incredible when you think about it. When you give people the power to use these tools, no matter what their background is, who knows what they can come up with?
That's what I'm saying. So I do have one concern about all of this automation. Doesn't it feel like we might be losing something? I mean, isn't part of what makes deep learning so powerful the expertise of the humans behind it?
That's a really good point and a valid concern. But honestly, I think AutoKeras can actually make human experts even better at what they do.
Really? How so?
Okay, so think about it like this. A really good carpenter, they don't need to carve every single piece of furniture completely by hand.
Right. They have tools to help them.
Exactly. They use tools so they can get things done faster, and so they can really focus on the design.
The artistic part.
Yes. So AutoKeras is kind of like that, like a really high-tech tool for creating AI.
Yeah.
It lets the human experts focus on the bigger picture instead of getting bogged down in the details.
Okay, so it's like AutoKeras takes care of all the tedious stuff and lets the humans focus on the really creative, high-level thinking.
Exactly. It frees them up to solve bigger problems and come up with totally new ideas.
I like that. So I have to ask, what are some examples of AutoKeras out in the wild? Like, what kind of problems is it already solving?
Oh, there's a ton of really interesting examples. Like in healthcare, for example, scientists are using AutoKeras to create models that can detect things like cancer way earlier than we could before.
Wow, that's incredible.
And with much better accuracy, too.
That's amazing and really important.
It is. And it can help doctors come up with better treatments for their patients, too.
So it's like having a whole team of specialists, but in a computer looking for things that might get missed otherwise.
It is, and it's not just limited to healthcare either.
Oh, right. You mentioned that before. What else are people using it for?
Well, there are people using it to make buildings more energy efficient.
Cool.
And it's even being used to create new types of art and music.
Wow. That's wild. It seems like AI is quickly becoming a normal part of our lives. It's really exciting, but also a little bit, I don't know, intimidating.
It definitely is both, but that's all the more reason to be having these conversations. We have to make sure these tools are being used responsibly and ethically.
Right, like just because we can do something doesn't always mean we should, right?
Exactly. It's really important to think about the implications of all of this and to get experts in ethics and policy involved in the process too.
So it's not just about building AI, it's about building the future of AI and making sure it's a future we actually want to live in.
I love that. I couldn't have said it better myself.
We've talked a lot about AutoKeras itself, all the technical parts of it,
Hmm.
and some of the exciting ways it's being used, but there's one thing we haven't talked about yet.
And what's that?
What does all of this mean for everyone else, the people listening to this right now?
Oh, that's a great point.
What possibilities does this open up for them?
And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about how anyone can get started with AutoKeras,
Oh, perfect.
even if they have zero experience with coding. And we'll leave you with some things to think about to get those creative juices flowing.
It's pretty amazing to think that anyone can just pick up AutoKeras and start using deep learning, but it's easy to feel like you need, a supercomputer to even get started. At least that's what I always think of when I hear about AI.
I know, right? Like it's this really intimidating thing.
It
But the
is.
truth is, it's becoming so much more accessible.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah, you really don't need a ton of fancy equipment to get started with this stuff. A lot of times, a laptop is all you need, plus the right tools, obviously.
So if someone is listening to us right now and thinking, okay, this is cool, I want to try this out, where do they even begin?
Well, that's the cool thing about AutoKeras. It's built on these frameworks that already exist, like Keras and TensorFlow.
Okay.
And those are used by a ton of people, so they're really well documented. There are tons of
Hmm.
resources online, like tutorials and stuff.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And there are even like online communities dedicated to helping people learn this stuff.
So it's not like they'd be completely on their own trying to figure it all out.
Not at all. Plus, AutoKeras makes everything so much simpler.
Hmm.
So you can really just focus on the core concepts of deep learning without getting too overwhelmed by all the little details. It's kind of like having a teacher there to walk you through it all.
That makes me feel better, honestly. So something we talked about earlier that I thought was really cool was this idea that AutoKeras could help bridge the gap between like the scientists doing the research and the people who are actually using it in the real world. Does that make sense?
Totally. That's one of the things I'm most excited about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for the longest time, all these amazing discoveries in AI were just stuck in these academic papers that, nobody outside of universities ever really read.
Right, totally. It's not like I subscribe to scientific journals or anything.
Most people don't. But with AutoKeras, people in all sorts of fields can take these amazing discoveries and actually use them.
So instead of having to wait years for something to go from like a research paper to an actual tool people can use, they could just start using it right away.
Yeah. Like, imagine if a doctor could read about a new way to diagnose a disease one day and actually start using that new method the very next day in their clinic.
Wow, that's amazing.
Or what if someone figured out a better way to, like, direct traffic in a city to cut down on traffic jams? They could use that new method almost immediately to make the city run better.
It's kind of like, well, it's like you said, it's breaking down that wall between the researchers and everyone else.
Exactly. But like we were saying before, it's really important that we use all of this power responsibly.
Absolutely.
Just because we can do all these amazing things with AI, that doesn't always mean that we should.
It's like having any other powerful tool, really.
It is.
You have to make sure you're using it for the right reasons.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to think about the ethics of it all. It's not just about building smarter machines, it's about building a better future for all of us.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot today. We started with the basics of deep learning, then we dove into all the ways that AutoKeras can make it easier for anyone to use, and then we even talked about some of the bigger implications for, like, society as a whole.
It's been quite the journey.
It really has. But before we go, we want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay, what's that?
If you had the power of AutoKeras at your fingertips, what would you do with it? What problem would you try to solve big or small?
It's a big question.
It is, but it's an important one to think about. Because the future of AI, it's not just something that's happening in some far-off lab, it's something that we're all creating together. So thanks for joining us for the deep dive.